The scent of centuries of secrets hung in the air. Dr. Elias Thorne, a name forgotten by academia, had just unearthed something that shouldn't exist. It wasn't just an ancient papyrus, but a whisper of a truth that could implode everything we know about faith. He questioned, what if salvation isn't for everyone? What if it's a cosmic lottery, a privilege for a select few? The text, corroded by time, offered no easy answers, but a cruel doubt. The meaning of life we seek, would it be just an illusion? The Vatican, with its millennia-old walls, would do anything to keep this secret buried. But Elias now carried the weight of a revelation that could dismantle the hope of billions. What happens when faith unravels? And who is prepared to face the void? Tell me, how is your faith today? Do you believe we will all be saved? But saved from what exactly? Leave it in the comments, so I know I'm not alone on this journey. The air in the subterranean archive at Georgetown University was heavy, thick with the scent of aged paper, dust, and a hint of mildew that seemed to cling to the soul. For Dr. Eleanor Vance, however, it was the perfume of truth, an aroma that propelled her through sleepless nights and piles of forgotten manuscripts. She was a brilliant but stubbornly marginalized historian, with a reputation for pursuing apocryphal texts that mainstream academia preferred to ignore. That night, rain lashed furiously against the few grated windows above, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the accelerated beat of her own heart. Her fingers, stained with ink and dust, traced the lines of a parchment unearthed from a forgotten box, labeled only Miscellaneous 3rd Century. The texture was different. The script, an ancient Aramaic dialect she barely recognized, was disturbingly elegant. Preliminary dating, done with rudimentary equipment she had assembled herself, placed it among the earliest Christian texts, perhaps even predating many canonical Gospels. A wave of heat rose up her spine, not from the stuffy environment, but from pure adrenaline. This was not just another fragment. There was a palpable energy emanating from that text, a promise of something grand and terrible. She pulled out her old Aramaic English dictionary, its pages worn and yellowed, and began to decipher. The first words were familiar, references to a master and his disciples, but soon the narrative veered onto a dark, unknown path. "Salvation is not for all," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible over the drumming rain. "Only for those who truly comprehend the sacrifice, and few are the chosen." The phrase repeated again and again like a macabre mantra. Her blood ran cold. This was not a theological variation, it was a direct contradiction, a blow to the heart of the doctrine of universal grace. What she held in her hands was not just an ancient text, it was a theological time bomb, capable of exploding centuries of faith and hope. The feeling of standing on the edge of an abyss, with the cold wind of truth blowing in her face, was almost unbearable. She knew her life and perhaps the world would never be the same. The responsibility weighed like a stone in her chest. Who else knew about this? Why was it hidden? Eleanor's mind reeled, trying to process the magnitude of what she was reading. Each translated line seemed to unravel a layer of a millennia-old conspiracy, a secret so profound that the Catholic Church itself, with all its history and power, would have striven to bury it. The scent of sandalwood, perhaps from some ancient incense that permeated the parchment, now mingled with the metallic smell of fear rising in her throat. She felt a pang of panic, a chilling certainty that she had stumbled upon something that should never have been found. The world outside, with its comfortable beliefs and promises of universal salvation, was about to be turned upside down. And she, Eleanor Vance, was the one holding the detonator. Still with trembling hands over the manuscript, Eleanor felt the need to share this discovery. But not with academia, not yet. It was something more intimate, more urgent. "This story is deeply personal to me, and I know many of you might relate to the search for a truth that shakes everything we believe," she thought, feeling a connection to an invisible audience. "If you're following along, tell me what city and country you're watching this from. It's quick, discreet, and helps me feel like I'm not alone on this journey." The phrase seemed to form in her mind, a silent plea for companionship amidst the impending storm. She knew she needed help, someone to validate what her eyes saw and her mind processed. Professor Daniel Hayes, her former mentor and colleague, was the only person she trusted enough for this, but even he, with all his academic skepticism, would be prepared for such a devastating truth. The rain outside continued, relentless, as if the sky itself was weeping for what was about to be revealed. The following days blurred into a haze of caffeine, dusty books, and the cold glow of the computer screen. Eleanor and Daniel Hayes, a man with graying hair and glasses perched on his nose, who exuded the aura of an inveterate skeptic, plunged into the manuscript. Daniel's office on campus was a labyrinth of book stacks and articles, with the scent of cheap whiskey he occasionally drank to stimulate thought. With each translated word, each deciphered phrase, the gravity of the gospel of choice became clearer, more terrifying. It wasn't just an alternative interpretation, it was a complete rewrite of the divine promise. The text, which they provisionally named the Gospel of Thomas the Dissident, detailed a vision of Jesus that preached salvation as an arduous, almost impossible path, destined only for a spiritual elite who could meet criteria of purity and esoteric knowledge that most of humanity would never achieve. It suggested, with disturbing coldness, that the vast majority of souls were intrinsically lost, not destined for divine grace, regardless of their good deeds or superficial faith. "This is heresy in its purest form, Eleanor," Daniel whispered, the whiskey glass forgotten in his hand. His eyes, usually filled with an intellectual sparkle, were now wide with shock. "It's not just an apocryphal text, it's an anathema. If this is real, if it's authentic, the Catholic Church, the faith of billions, everything we know, collapses." Eleanor felt a knot in her throat. The responsibility of unearthing this truth was overwhelming. She saw the panic in Daniel's eyes, a man who prided himself on his unshakable logic, and it only reinforced the magnitude of the discovery. Fear was no longer a whisper. It was a silent scream that filled the small office. They knew they had something the world wasn't ready to see, a truth that could destroy more than it could build. News of the discovery, like a silent virus, began to spread, not through academic channels but through darker means, perhaps an informant within the university itself, or an accidental leak from one of Daniel's research assistants. The Vatican, an entity that seemed to operate in the shadows of history, was alerted. In Rome, Cardinal Thorne, a man whose presence was as imposing as the cathedrals he oversaw, received the news with cold, calculated calm. His eyes, which had witnessed centuries of secrets and intrigues, narrowed. He was the guardian of orthodoxy, a pillar of faith, and he knew this threat was existential. "Retrieve the manuscript, silence those involved. At any cost," he ordered his agents, his voice a chilling murmur that carried the weight of 1,000 years of power. Eleanor and Daniel felt the shift in the air before they even saw the signs. Anonymous text messages, dark cars parked on the street, the feeling of being watched. Paranoia set in, turning every shadow into a threat. "They know, Daniel," Eleanor said, her voice strained. "They're coming." The pursuit began subtly, but soon became undeniable. Their quiet academic lives were shattered, replaced by a desperate race for survival. They were no longer just scholars. They were fugitives, with a world-shaking secret in their hands. The only option was to flee, protect the gospel, and find a way to make it public before they were silenced forever. Night fell over Washington, D.C., and with it, the certainty that the darkness pursuing them was far older and more powerful than they could ever have imagined. The escape from Washington, D.C. was a blur of adrenaline and hasty decisions. Eleanor and Daniel, with the original manuscript and encrypted digital copies in a worn backpack, drove south towards the Appalachians. The idea was to hide in the vast, impenetrable forest, using Daniel's knowledge of trails and isolated cabins. The rain, which seemed to have become a constant in their lives, lashed against the windshield of the rented car, turning the road into a shimmering river. The scent of pine and wet earth permeated the car, a strange contrast to the smell of fear and whiskey that still clung to their clothes. They felt like prey, with the Vatican as a relentless predator, its claws extending across the continent. "They won't stop, Eleanor," Daniel said, his eyes fixed on the dark road. "Cardinal Thorne cannot allow this to come out. It's the end of everything for them." Doubt gnawed at Daniel. He, the skeptic, the man of science, now found himself confronted with a truth that challenged his entire understanding of the world. He questioned not only the Church, but the very nature of faith and truth. Eleanor, in turn, wrestled with the responsibility. Every step they took, every mile traveled, was a heavier burden. Revealing this truth would be liberating, but also devastating. She wondered if she had the right to shake the faith of billions, to tear away the comfort of a promise of universal salvation. In a small town in rural Virginia, they found an unexpected ally, Father Michael O'Connell, a former priest disillusioned with the bureaucracy and hypocrisy of the church, who now lived a reclusive life, managing a small second-hand bookstore. Daniel knew him from his seminary days, before Michael left the priesthood. The scent of old books and fresh coffee filled the bookstore, a temporary refuge from the chaos outside. Michael, with his tired but perceptive eyes, listened to their story with grim seriousness. "I always knew there were more secrets than they told us," he said, his voice hoarse. "But this is something that could break the world." He offered help, a safe hiding place in a remote cabin he owned, and his contacts with investigative journalists who might be willing to take the risk. The cabin, hidden deep in the forest, offered a brief respite. The warmth of the fireplace and the smell of burning wood were a balm to their nerves, but the peace was short-lived. One night, as Daniel and Eleanor reviewed the translations, Michael went out to get supplies in the nearest town. He never returned. The news came through a local newspaper, a car accident on the winding mountain road. No witnesses. But Eleanor and Daniel knew it wasn't an accident. Michael's loss was a brutal blow, an emotional rupture that left them even more isolated and determined. The pain of loss mingled with anger and the certainty that the Vatican would not hesitate to use violence to protect its secret. Michael's body was a silent testament to the cruelty that awaited them if they failed. The night in the cabin was cold, and the wind howled through the trees, seeming to mourn the loss of a friend. Eleanor knew that from that moment on, the fight was not just for truth, but for vengeance. Father Michael's death solidified Eleanor and Daniel's resolve, but also plunged them into silent grief and escalating paranoia. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a tomb, permeated with their friend's absence. They knew they could no longer trust anyone. The only way to honor Michael was to expose the truth, no matter the cost. They delved even deeper into the manuscript, seeking not just the translation but the context, the history of its suppression. They found references to other texts, to ancient councils, and to forgotten figures of the early church who seem to have advocated similar ideas. Through ancient documents, microfilms from university archives, and even some rare texts Daniel had kept for years, they began to piece together the puzzle. They discovered that the Gospel of Thomas the Dissident was not the only text to propose exclusive salvation. There were others, all systematically suppressed in the early centuries of Christianity. The official Vatican narrative had always been that these texts were discarded as heretical for contradicting Christ's message of universal love and salvation. The Church, they argued, had acted to protect the faith of the masses, to prevent the social and theological chaos that a doctrine of exclusive salvation would cause. Cardinal Thorne, in his public speeches, often echoed this rhetoric, defending the Church as the guardian of hope and unity. But as Eleanor and Daniel dug deeper, the story began to unravel in a far more sinister way. They found coded correspondences, diaries of ancient bishops and cardinals, and even a secret will from a 5th century pope. The smell of whiskey, which Daniel now drank more frequently, mingled with the scent of old paper and the feeling of a cold, relentless truth approaching. Slowly the terrible reality revealed itself. The Vatican did not hide the gospel merely to protect the faith of the masses. They hid it because they believed in its truth. The plot twist hit Eleanor with the force of lightning. The Vatican, for centuries, had not only suppressed the Gospel of Thomas the Dissident, but had secretly adhered to its doctrine of exclusive salvation. The promise of universal salvation was a facade, a tool of control to maintain order and power over the masses. True faith, true salvation, was reserved for an elite within the Church itself, those who knew the true path, the chosen ones. Cardinal Thorne was not a villain protecting humanity from a painful truth. He was a guardian of a monumental lie, an active participant in a millennia-long charade. The feeling of heat Eleanor felt was not from persecution, but from a burning fury. The empathy she had felt for the cardinal's dilemma transformed into cold, calculated rage. Faith was not just a matter of belief. It was a weapon, and the Vatican had wielded it masterfully for centuries. The discovery was not just a hidden secret. It was the revelation of a betrayal on a cosmic scale. The revelation of the true nature of the gospel's suppression hit Eleanor and Daniel like a physical blow. The initial shock gave way to cold anger and unwavering determination. The cabin, once a refuge, now seemed too small to contain the magnitude of the truth they carried. The scent of pine and wet earth, which once brought a sense of isolation, now felt suffocating. They were not just fighting an institution that wanted to protect its secrets. They were fighting one that had built its empire on a deliberate lie. "They're not protecting faith, Daniel," Eleanor said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "They're protecting power, and the truth is the only thing that can bring them down." Daniel nodded, his tired eyes reflecting the same fury. The whiskey he drank now was not to stimulate thought, but to numb the pain of betrayal he felt on behalf of all humanity. They knew the exposure needed to be global, undeniable, and immediate. They could no longer rely on local journalists or discreet leaks. They needed a platform that could reach every corner of the planet. The plan began to take shape. They contacted a network of digital activists and independent investigative journalists, known for their ability to operate outside traditional channels and for their dedication to truth, no matter how dangerous. Contact was made through encrypted channels, with code names and meetings in busy public places, like Grand Central Station in New York, where the crowd offered anonymity. The smell of coffee, pretzels, and the constant hum of the city were a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the cabin. The tension was palpable, every shadow, every unknown face, a potential threat. Meanwhile, the Vatican was not idle. Eleanor and Daniel felt the pressure mounting. Attempts to hack their devices, threatening messages disguised as spam, and the constant feeling of being tracked. Cardinal Thorne, aware of the imminent threat, mobilized all his resources. He knew the exposure would not just be a scandal, it would be theological Armageddon. He sent teams to track them, to discredit anything they might release, to plant false information. The battle was no longer physical, it was a war of information, a silent battle for the truth and the faith of billions. Eleanor felt the heat of the pursuit, not just in her body but in her soul. She knew they were on the brink of a precipice, and the leap would be irreversible. The night before the broadcast, she looked at Daniel, her eyes meeting his in a silent understanding. "There's no turning back, is there?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "No," he replied, with a firmness she hadn't seen in a long time. "They forced us into this. Now, the world will know." The clock was ticking, and the fate of faith was about to be rewritten. The broadcast date arrived, and with it, an almost unbearable tension. Eleanor and Daniel were in an improvised, yet technologically advanced bunker, somewhere beneath the Arizona desert, a location chosen for its discretion and difficulty of access. The air conditioning hummed, but the heat of anxiety was palpable. The smell of electronic equipment and the cold sweat on their bodies filled the small space. Millions of people worldwide were tuned in, drawn by rumors of an unprecedented revelation. When Eleanor began to speak, her voice, initially trembling, gained strength. She presented the Gospel of Thomas the Dissident, displaying images of the manuscript, meticulous translations, and evidence of its suppression. Daniel, by her side, provided historical context, deepening the narrative of the conspiracy. With each word, each image, the world reacted. Shock, anger, disbelief, but also a strange liberation for those who had always felt something was wrong, that the promise of universal salvation was too good to be true. Social media exploded. News channels interrupted their programming. The world was ablaze. In the Vatican, Cardinal Thorne watched the broadcast with an impassive expression, but his eyes revealed an inner storm. He knew this was the moment of his life, the moment he would have to defend centuries of secrets. Hours after the revelation, he appeared at a global press conference, his imposing figure and his voice resonating with authority. The scent of incense and the grandeur of the Clementine Hall could not hide the impending crisis. "My brothers and sisters in Christ, and all those who seek truth," he began, his voice calm and controlled, yet laden with contained emotion. "The Catholic Church has always been the guardian of faith, hope, and the promise of salvation for all humanity. The text revealed today, though ancient, is a dangerous and divisive interpretation. It preaches a doctrine of exclusivity that contradicts the very heart of Christ's message, unconditional love and grace for all." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd of journalists. "Yes, the Church, in its millennia-old wisdom, has made difficult decisions to protect the faith of the masses, to prevent the chaos, despair, and division that a doctrine of exclusive salvation would bring. Truth sometimes is a burden too heavy for humanity to bear, and faith, hope, the promise of a paradise accessible to all, is what keeps us united, what gives us purpose. His speech was a masterpiece of rhetoric, blending half-truths with a passionate defense of the need to protect faith, even if it meant hiding uncomfortable truths. He did not deny the gospel's existence, but framed it as a threat to unity and hope. He did not admit to the conspiracy, but justified the church's actions as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. The world was divided. Many felt betrayed, anger simmering in their veins. Others, comforted by the cardinal's words, defended the church, arguing that faith was more important than an ancient text that could destroy hope. Night fell over a world in shock, a world that would never be the same, divided between revealed truth and defended faith. The world plunged into unprecedented theological and social chaos. The Catholic Church and many other Christian denominations faced an existential crisis. Believers felt betrayed, their entire lives built on a promise that now seemed a sham. Protests erupted in cities around the globe, with people demanding answers, justice, and for some, the complete truth, no matter how painful. The smell of burning tires and the feeling of collective rage hung in the air. Eleanor and Daniel, now controversial figures, were heroes to some and heretics to others. They became targets of threats from all sides, not only from the Vatican, which continued its efforts to discredit and silence them, but also from religious extremists who saw the Gospel of Thomas the Dissident as a validation of their own exclusivist beliefs. New cults began to emerge, based on the doctrine of salvation for the few, preaching a message of spiritual superiority and disdain for the lost. Fear and panic spread, and the line between faith and madness became increasingly thin. The pressure on Eleanor and Daniel was immense. The media hounded them, their personal lives were exposed, and security became a constant concern. Their relationship, once based on academic respect and a common cause, was tested to its limits. Sleepless nights, heated arguments about the next step, and the weight of responsibility for having unleashed such global turmoil. Daniel, who had always been the skeptic, now wrestled with the guilt of having helped dismantle the faith of millions. Eleanor, in turn, felt the bitterness of the Vatican's betrayal, but also the pain of seeing humanity fragment. "We did the right thing, Daniel," Eleanor said one night, as they watched the news on television, showing more protests and divisions. The truth needed to be revealed. Daniel merely sighed, the whiskey glass in his hand. At what cost, Eleanor, at what cost? The search for meaning became a global obsession. People re-evaluated their own lives, their beliefs, what it meant to be saved or lost. The promise of a universal paradise had been replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. Amidst all the chaos, a new threat emerged. An extremist group, self-proclaimed the Chosen, began to pursue Eleanor and Daniel, believing they were the messengers of a new era and that the gospel gave them the right to purify the world. The feeling of heat Eleanor felt was no longer just from the Vatican's pursuit, but from a dangerous fanaticism that had been awakened. They had liberated a truth, but they had also unleashed a monster. The fight for truth had turned into a fight for survival itself, and the line between good and evil, between faith and madness, never seemed so indistinct. The Gospel of Thomas the Dissident was now in the public domain, an undeniable part of humanity's religious history. It was no longer a secret, but a catalyst for a new era of questioning and spiritual seeking. The world, though divided, was more aware, more critical, and perhaps, paradoxically, freer to seek its own truth. Eleanor and Daniel, exhausted but with a strange sense of purpose, emerged from the storm as controversial figures. They were heroes to those who valued truth above all else, and heretics to those who clung to traditional faith. They continued to advocate for research, translation, and the importance of critical thinking, dedicating their lives to guiding people through the labyrinth of new interpretations and beliefs. They did not find a new life in the sense of peace and tranquility, but rather a liberation from the oppression of secrecy, a new mission in a world desperately needing guidance. The smell of books and coffee, once a refuge, was now the environment of their new intellectual battlefield. Cardinal Thorne, in turn, faced the consequences of his actions. His reputation was tarnished, his authority questioned. He was forced to resign, but not before delivering one last enigmatic speech, suggesting that humanity was not yet ready for certain truths, and that faith, even if based on a more inclusive narrative, was essential for social cohesion. He disappeared from public life, perhaps to continue his own twisted version of faith in secret, or to face his own demons in seclusion. The ending was not an easy resolution. Faith, as Eleanor and Daniel learned, was complex, multifaceted, and deeply personal. The gospel did not bring peace, but rather a new era of uncertainty and seeking. Salvation was still a mystery, but now with a new and disturbing perspective. Humanity stood at a crossroads, forced to confront the fragility of its beliefs and the strength of its own capacity for questioning. The final image was powerful and ambiguous, a crowd in a New York park debating fervently, some with copies of the Gospel of Thomas the Dissident in their hands, others with rosaries, and some just with lost looks. A close-up on the manuscript, now exposed for all to see, its ancient and challenging words, a silent testament that truth once revealed cannot be buried again. The line between faith and madness, between hope and despair, had been permanently blurred. This story is an invitation to reflection, a journey through the depths of faith and doubt. If you felt touched, provoked, or inspired by this narrative, please subscribe and engage. Your stories, your questions, your own searches for meaning are what make all this real. Share your ideas in the comments. Would you like a second part, exploring the long-term consequences or new stories with other characters facing similar dilemmas? Your voice is important, and I am grateful you joined me on this journey.